Story number one. This happened to me in the summer of 2018 at a fishing spot I'd visited with my Uncle Mark ever since I was a kid. It's weirdly isolated. No cabins, no docks, just a wide, muddy tongue of shoreline surrounded on all sides by thick bush and old hardwoods. There's only one gravel access road, and nobody goes there unless they know about it, which made it perfect for night fishing and camping. Uncle Mark and I rolled up late, around 11, and set up our gear. The sounds out there were normal. Frogs croaking, fish plunking out on the black water, the whine of mosquitoes. We had the lantern going, casting these messy yellow pools of light and making the trees look farther away than they really were. We got into a little rhythm, quietly so as not to scare the fish, lost in our own thoughts. I remember it smelling like wet mud, and Uncle Mark chain-smoked when he thought he could sneak them past me. At some point, I guess it was hitting 3 in the morning, I wandered away from the lantern to take a leak and stretch my legs. That's when I saw her, a silhouette, a real human, a girl in all flesh. Whatever she was, she questioned all the beliefs I had. She was about 50 yards up the bank, standing weirdly still right at the shoreline curve. I could finally make out, a girl, maybe 10 or 11, small and rail-thin, wearing what I thought at first was a rain jacket, but it shimmered in the lantern spill like bright tin foil, a silver poncho, practically glowing against the mud and black. Her hair was long and straight, dark enough to show up in the moonlight. I couldn't see her face clearly, but whatever I could make of it, her face looked as if she didn't look like a human. She was just watching us. No flashlight, not making a sound, arms limp at her sides. She didn't call for help, didn't flinch when Uncle Mark shouted, "Are you okay?" Her face now looked expressionless, pale and blurry in a way that didn't make sense at that distance. It was as if someone had purposefully distorted her face so that no one could recognize her. I remember being hit by this instant, primal unease, like what I was seeing should not be there. You ever have that feeling where your brain keeps telling you something's off about what you're looking at, but you can't make sense of it? For whatever reason, I thought if I looked away, she'd come closer, so I kept staring, holding my breath. Uncle Mark put down his rod and grabbed his old army flashlight, one of those heavy mag lights. The beam swept out across the cove, the glare making it hard to see. The girl barely moved. Honestly, she didn't even twitch. The water lapped quietly at her feet, but her silver poncho stayed completely still, like the wind skipped her. I called out again, louder, "Hey, are you all right?" No answer, no movement, not even a shift in her arms or head. Uncle Mark, who was always calm, started walking toward her, cussing under his breath. I was right behind him, holding my phone more like a lucky charm than a camera. The closer we got, the weirder she looked, somehow too thin or stretched. Her feet didn't make prints in the mud. There should have been some sign, splash, crunch, something. But it was like she wasn't even pressing down. It was as if she were floating or could fly, but she was standing in front of us at least. Right when Uncle Mark aimed the beam at her face, she turned. Her head moved, but the rest of her didn't, only her neck bending at an unnatural angle. Her face wasn't shadowed but blurred out by the reflection from the poncho, washed in bright silver. She stared straight at us, then in a single jerky movement, swung around and stepped into the bush behind her. What sticks with me is that she didn't make any noise. No twigs snapping, no leaves rustling, nothing. And in the mud, not a single print, even though Uncle Mark's heavy boots left deep tracks next to me as we followed. We spent an hour searching the tree line, calling out, "Are you lost? We can help." All the while there was no answer, and honestly, no sense that we weren't completely alone. Uncle Mark finally muttered, "We're leaving." Now, I never heard him scared like that. Just as we turned to leave, I saw one last time before leaving, and that's when she was there, but now floating in the air, head tilted downward, an unnatural grin spreading across her face. But her eyes, bloodshot red, and she was crying, tears of blood. I couldn't help but stare at her. It was as if she had some hold on me. I had long forgotten that Uncle Mark had gone far away, leaving me and that girl alone. And then, Uncle Mark shouted my name, And that's when I blinked, and she was gone, vanished into the thin air. I ran back to Uncle Mark as fast as I could. We packed up in total silence, using just our headlamps. Going up the gravel path, there's this feeling like someone's watching, every hair prickling on my neck and arms. Occasionally, I'd swing my light behind us, and I swear, in the tangle of saplings and vines, I'd catch the faintest flash of silver, like a mirror catching starlight, again and again. After that, I kept seeing the shimmer for weeks, at home, driving, in half-awake dreams, always just on the edge of where light fades to dark, the same way she looked on the shore. I went back to that spot a few months later in broad daylight, and there were no footprints, no sign of a campfire or gear, nothing to suggest anybody had been there but us. Maybe it was just a kid who wandered off. Maybe my eyes played tricks in the weird moonlight, reflecting off water and metal. But neither of us ever really bought it. It was cold animal dread, the kind you don't invent. I fish sometimes, but never there. Not at night. I don't need to see her again, especially if she's still watching in that silver glare, waiting for someone to see her face more clearly than I did. Story number 2. A couple of years ago, I hiked the Northville Placid Trail in upstate New York, mostly solo. I'd done the first half before, but that autumn I planned to finish it, old school, with just a pack and a tarp. It's wild out there, endless pine and spruce, ferns so thick you'd miss a moose 10 feet away. The only sign of civilization is the lean-to shelters the Department of Environmental Conservation built decades ago. Most hikers avoid them: mice, cold drafts, the odd spider the size of your thumb. But it had rained all afternoon, so when I stumbled out of the woods at dusk and saw the battered roof of Cedar Notch shelter, I was honestly relieved. I was alone. There wasn't a soul for miles, not even the usual scribbles on the register book. The forest felt bigger than usual, heavy. As dark fell, the wind died, leaving the kind of silence that presses in on your ears. Not a branch creaked, not a cricket, not even the chitter of those brazen little mice. Just the steady drip of water off pine needles and the sound of my own clothes drying by the small fire I'd coaxed to life. I cooked some ramen and settled in. The interior smelled like wet wood and something slightly sour, like a forgotten apple core. I sat up, reading by the headlamp. Around 11, fog rolled in thick and white, muffling the little light from the moon. I closed my book and tried to sleep, tucked in my bag, facing out toward the woods. Sometime after midnight, I woke, half dreaming, at first sure I'd heard footsteps. Not animals. These were slow, heavy, measured, crunching the wet leaf litter, then stopping just outside where the log floor ended. I lay still, every limb rigid, heart pounding so loud I thought it might give me away. Then I heard it, the unmistakable ancient sound of a wooden door opening. The noise rang clear, a strained, groaning creak. Hinges rusted nearly to breaking, held in for a single, shattering moment. Then softer shuffling steps, the floor of the shelter vibrating in a subtle, rhythmic way. Another heavy pause, then the door clicked shut with a thick thump, sealing out the air, cutting off even the breath of the wind. This made no sense. The shelter was open on one side, no doors. I reached out, hand trembling, and fumbled for my camping knife in the dark. The silence fell again, an almost painful absence of noise. I could feel my own sweat turning cold, slick against my chest. As my eyes adjusted, I caught something. A puddle on the floor near the entrance, spreading in a slow, viscous circle. It shimmered faintly in the blue-gray light, too thick and dark to be rainwater, with a raw, metallic tang that clawed at my nose. I stared, not daring to shine my headlamp. On the opposite wall, about 6 feet up, a row of 5 deep gouges, raw and splintered, as if something strong had dragged heavy nails through the ancient wood. They hadn't been there when I arrived. I'd have noticed. Right under those marks, the boards glistened moistly, little beads of something still seeping along the grain. Tension closed around my body. Every part of me wanted to run. But the idea of leaving that shelter, stepping out into fog so thick I wouldn't see more than 2 feet, was worse. I spent the next hour listening to the silence, and sometimes I could swear it wasn't entirely silent. Once or twice I heard the floor creak, as though someone heavy shifted their weight on the boards directly behind me, just out of sight. Once I thought I caught a low, guttural breath, wheezing just beneath the wind sigh. Dawn, when it finally came, felt like rescue. In the slant of gray light, the shelter looked normal, if old. But the puddle was still there, a dark, sticky patch that didn't belong, quickly absorbed by my bandana when I wiped at it. The gouges in the wall were real, deep enough for my fingers to slip inside. I searched for tracks outside, but the ground was undisturbed except for my own. That morning, as I shouldered my pack, I saw something that makes my skin crawl even now. Right where the floor met the dirt, just by the corner post, a set of old boot prints faced inward, pressed deep into the pine needles, larger and wider than mine, spaced oddly, as if someone had been standing there watching for hours. The prints led nowhere, just faded into the moss and vanished. I finished the rest of that trail, but I never slept in a shelter again. Could it have been a trick of the fog, my imagination, the leftovers of some squatters last night there? Maybe. That's easier to believe than the truth that sometimes in the deep woods, you hear doors opening where none should exist, and something might just come through. Story number 3. A few years back, 3 of my close friends, Ryan, Mark, Jess, and I, went backpacking in Pisgah National Forest. We wanted a real backcountry weekend, off the main trails, just us, our gear, and the endless North Carolinian woods. We picked a stretch of old forest along a barely used segment of the Mountains to Sea Trail, figured we'd hike out a few miles and pitch camp wherever the trees felt right. We got a late start, so dusk was already sliding through the trees when we hit a flatter stretch of trail. That's when we found the campsite. It was just off the trail, kind of tucked behind a fallen pine. There was a camo tarp, a battered 2-man tent, a rusty blue camp chair, and a stone-ringed fire pit filled with ash and half-burned bits of log. Beside the fire, a dirty plate still had a mess of mashed beans and rice, and next to it, weirdest of all, was a waterlogged paperback library book, the edges swollen and fuzzy, pages spread open as if someone had just set it down. We stood there a minute, half expecting someone to step out of the woods, but no sign of anyone. No movement, no voices. It looked like a ragged setup, maybe a couple of through hikers or a homeless camp, or someone just squatting out there. Ryan whistled. "Anyone home?" But nothing called back but a crow, far off. The forest just seemed to close around us, the shadows deeper than they should be under that thick canopy. We agreed not to set up right next to them. Even if the owners were just regular hikers, nobody likes company in the wild unless they ask for it. So we hiked maybe another half a mile, found a decent flat patch by a creek, and set up. That night was colder than expected, and I was half asleep in my bag when I heard voices down trail, drifting as if carried on the wind. A woman's sharp, angry whisper, then what sounded like a child sobbing, then it faded away. Mark heard it too, whispered, "Did you hear them fighting?" But Jess muttered it was just the wind in the hollows. We all managed to drift back to sleep, shivering a little, my ears tuned for footsteps that never came. The following morning, curiosity got us. We wanted to see if the other group was up for a chat, or if we should drop a note about the leftovers for bears, or maybe just say hi. When we hiked back down, the forest looked different. I know that sounds off, but the light filtered through the trees was sharper, colder somehow. Where the campsite had been, there was nothing. The tarp, the tent, the chair, the food, all gone. The ash ring was missing, not a fleck in the pine needles. No footprints, save our own from the previous evening. The only mark was one deep groove in the soil, a big half moon, as if someone had dug a heel in and slipped. We stared, certain we were in the right spot. We'd marked the fallen pine and everything. Ryan tried to laugh it off, but the sound died in the air. We spread out, checked every angle, thinking maybe we'd gone too far uphill or missed a turn, but all the landmarks matched. It was like the earth had swallowed every trace of that camp. When Jess stooped to check the ground, she found something that made her face go white. Stuck among the pine duff where the campfire had been was a single small, shriveled handprint, like a child's, pressed deep into the mud and surrounded by a ring of crushed berries. The print was fresh, the only bit of moisture left on the cold ground. Mark muttered, "Somebody's messing with us." But there wasn't a twig broken, no scuff marks, no trash. Even the weak morning breeze was still. It started to rain as we turned back to our camp. When we got back, everything of ours was as we'd left it, except Ryan's boots, which he'd left by the fire, were gone. We searched everywhere. No sign they'd been carried off by animals. Just vanished. In their place was a muddy library checkout slip, water-stained but readable, stuck under a rock. The due date was from 3 years earlier. That second night, none of us slept. The woods felt wrong, too crowded with silence, too many movements in the corner of our vision that disappeared when we turned our head. I kept thinking I heard a zipper being slowly, carefully pulled open, or a chair scraping quietly over rough dirt. But every time I sat up, there was nothing beyond my friends' pale faces reflecting the glow of our lantern. We hiked out at sunrise, legs burning, talking little. Even back at the trailhead, standing in mud beside our truck, the sense of being watched clung to us. We never figured out what happened, if it was some elaborate prank, an optical trick, or something stranger. That forest gives things back to itself sometimes, or maybe lets you see a place that shouldn't be. All I know is 4 people saw that camp, and none of us have gone back looking for it. Some things vanish because they're ready, others because they're told. I still wake up sometimes, sure that I hear someone crying, far off, just out of sight, at the edge of the woods. Story number 4. I'd planned the trip as a break from screens, a long, meandering weekend with my partner Lena, in an Adirondack backcountry that prided itself on thick spruce, mossy silence, and days where you don't see another human soul. The trail was faint but blazed, and after 8 miles we set up camp by an old abandoned logging road where the birch trees grew pale as bone and the forest seemed to listen. I know this is creepy enough, but what's the fun until this hiking turned into a nightmare? The first morning, Lena was kneeling over the trunk of a red maple, phone in hand. "Did you do this?" she asked, not quite joking. Someone had carved the number 72 perfectly into the bark, about shoulder height, numbers big and crisp, as if pressed in by a machine. The bark pollen was fresh, yellow dust still sifting off the edges. It wasn't faded. This was new. I shrugged. "Probably a logging mark left over," I said. But even then, I wasn't sure. There were no other marks, no paint, no surveyor's tape. We noticed a few more things. The air smelled a little sweet, not sap but like spoiled fruit, and the silence between birdsong stretched on for hours. By nightfall, I heard small pebbles skipping against each other, right outside camp. Then nothing. The next morning, Lena nudged me awake and pulled me, bleary-eyed, to a different birch 3 campsites over. 34 was slashed and deep, not numbers so much as gouges, sharp, angry. Again, no footsteps. The rain in the night had left no prints. But where the number was carved, the ground below was scuffed in 3 straight lines, dead pine needles rearranged as if someone had raked them carefully with their fingers. We kept seeing numbers. Every morning, a fresh one on a new tree nearby. 18 on a basswood, etched with a steady hand, sharp corners. 5 on a poplar, low to the ground as if done by a child or someone kneeling. The sequence made no sense, high to low, none repeated. Each time the cut wood was raw, leaking sap like beads of sweat. There were never any marks left over from tools, and no one had passed our camp. No voices, no laughter, no neighbor's firelight. One cold dusk, as we boiled pasta by the fire, something hit me on the shoulder, a small round pebble. Not thrown hard, just flicked. I spun toward the tree line, heart thumping, sure I'd see a deer. All I caught were shadows and the hint of a sour, metallic odor that faded almost instantly. Lena felt cold and went inside the camp. It was me, sitting by the fire. Just as I sat close to the tent, more pebbles landed softly around me, and then just under the crackle of the fire came a low, steady hum, like someone drawing out a single, tuneless note. I got jittery. Lena came out and insisted we sleep with the hatchet close. In the pitch dark, branches snapped, and the rustle of leaves sounded less like animals and more deliberate, as if someone or something circled our tent, slow and patient. At one point, my phone buzzed from 2 feet away. I'd left it off, but now the screen flashed, showing 12 missed alarms, all scheduled for strange minutes. 7:18, 3:04, 1:09, none of which I'd ever set. The following morning, there was a new number, 11, on the big beach that stood beside our tent. We stared at it for a minute. The sap underneath was rusty, almost red, dripping silently. I slid my fingers over the carving and felt the chill of the wound radiate into my hand. That's when I noticed tiny teeth marks at the base of the beach, lined up in a circle. The perfect impression of a human grin, jaw far too wide. The food we'd hung 3 meters up the night before was untouched, but the bag was swinging gently on the branch, still spinning as we approached. Beneath it, a neat pile of pebbles was arranged into a spiral, 11 stones exactly. Lena wanted to leave, but I convinced her to try one more night, sure in the cool logic that we were just spooking ourselves. But dusk brought no peace. Instead, every so often we'd hear a rapid knocking. 3 times, then 4, then once, like knuckles on wood. The numbers again. The knocking would stop for minutes, then resume somewhere else. The campfire shadows began to flicker backward, as if some invisible form pressed close, and the smoke clung low, pressing our legs and never drifting up. When we turned in, I finally drifted into a fitful sleep. I woke to the frantic whisper of my own name, as if someone called just outside the mesh. Lena says she didn't hear it. At dawn, the final number was waiting. 0 at the trail's start, deep enough to show the blonde grain below. Next to it were 11 more beech leaves laid out in 2 rows, and a shard of bone. Animal, maybe or maybe not, all clean, picked white. We hurried out, back to civilization. I told myself it was some backwoods loner, a prankster who liked creeping out city hikers, or maybe just the strange ways night and fear color the mind. But sometimes in a sharp silence I hear that hum, and every now and then a string of numbers creeps into my dreams, growing lower and lower until there's nothing left. Story number 5. My friends and I, 6 of us, old college roommates reuniting, chose Norris Mountain for a late summer camping trip. It was August heat, dry and restless, so we picked a secluded clearing just off the ridge. We planned 3 nights with good food, beer, and enough stories to last till sunrise. I remember how loud we laughed the first day, filling the woods with all our old inside jokes. On the first night, none of us slept. I figured it was excitement and too much beer. But as 2 a.m. turned into 3, tiredness kicked in like a weight, and still we lay on our backs with our eyes wide, staring through the mesh ceiling at the pale glow of stars, listening to the wind nudge the trees. The air held a thick, sticky feeling, like waiting for a storm. At some point, just as I started to drift off, something shook my tent. Once, sharp and decisive, footsteps sloshed the pine needles. I sat up, heart pounding. I whispered, "Hey, who's out there?" expecting a prank. A deep silence followed, and the only sound was my own heavy breathing. In the other tent, Alex called, "Guys, did someone just shake mine too?" Sarah muttered, "Me too," sounding irritated but exhausted. I laughed it off. "Probably a raccoon," I said. The others agreed too easily, hungry for an explanation. Nobody stepped outside to check. I drifted to sleep with the uneasy feeling of eyes pressing against the fabric of my tent. The second night, everyone looked tired and on edge, but we blamed it on the cramped sleep and kept the fire going longer. At dusk, shadows flitted through the trees, long and dark in the dying sun, but I chalked it up to the wind. We toasted marshmallows and tried to shake the mood, but as soon as we zipped ourselves into our tents, it started. That sensation of being watched came back even heavier, a pressure on the chest, a prickle between my shoulder blades. Within minutes, the same shaking happened, harder this time. A persistent, slow rocking, like someone gripping the tent poles and moving them back and forth. Not enough to collapse the structure, just enough to remind you weren't alone. Everyone yelled this time, voices overlapping, accusing each other, half laughing, "All right, cut it out." Not a single one of us admitted to being outside. After maybe an hour, the rocking stopped, replaced by a heavy, raspy breathing just outside. Deep, slow inhales and careful, deliberate exhales, closer than I'd ever let a living thing get at night. I held my breath, waiting to hear shoes crunching away, but there was nothing except that unnatural exhale and the pounding of my own blood in my ears. I did eventually doze off. Exhaustion finally won. When I woke before dawn to a branch snapping near my tent, I caught a glimpse of something through the mesh in the weak moonlight. Something crouched low by the fire ring. It was human-shaped, but wrong. Long. Its silhouette was that of a person split in half and stitched together, doubled at the joints, arms and legs bent at sharp, unnatural angles. It was humming, a broken, tuneless noise so low I felt it in my teeth. Its head jerked fitfully as it touched each stone around the ashes, rearranging them into a perfect spiral. The kind you see in some weird dream. Frozen, I squeezed my eyes shut, heartbeat hammering, sweat pouring. When I dared to look again, the figure was gone, but the stones lay in a spiral and a chill clung to the inside of my tent. Nobody slept past sunrise. Everyone looked pale, haggard. I didn't mention what I'd seen right away, not wanting to sound crazy. But then Jake groaned. "Did anyone hear that weird humming last night? Like right outside?" Sarah was staring at the spiral of stones by the fire, her face drawn, and murmured that she'd heard voices whispering her name. We all started comparing notes, realizing the shaking, the breathing, the sense of movement had happened to each of us, separately and together. As we repacked, Rebecca shrieked. Her hiking boots were filled with murky, icy cold water, and her extra socks were shredded, laid out in a triangle. All of our backpacks had been tugged slightly open, and mud caked the zippers, but nothing was missing. That afternoon, the trees seemed to close in, shadows longer and darker. While we trekked the trail to leave, the melancholy humming followed us at intervals, rolling through the woods, sometimes far, sometimes near. With every mile, I felt the sensation of something shadow-thin watching from behind, pacing carefully between the trunks. When we finally made it back to the road, the air lightened. Phones that wouldn't turn on now flickered back to life. My phone suddenly buzzed with missed calls, the calls done at odd hours, all from numbers I didn't recognize. I tried calling back all the numbers, but either they were disconnected or switched off. I tried to scrape off the lingering terror as some mass hallucination, nerves, a prank gone overboard, even shared sleep paralysis. But sometimes back home in bed, I wake with that icy feeling of breath just outside the window and the sound of something shifting stones, humming a melody that never resolves. I still haven't slept right since. Some things in the woods want you awake. Story number 6. I had gone to a camping site with my 3 friends, Tori, Daniel, and Mia, doing a late October loop in the Jefferson National Forest. Nights dropped below freezing, the kind where the stars feel sharp enough to cut your skin, and every sound carries for miles. By our second night, we'd set up in a gully beneath a stand of bony sycamores, out of the wind. No one else for miles as far as we knew. After dinner, we sat out watching the fire die, breath frosting the air. Out past the range of our little lanterns, the woods clung to themselves in absolute blackness. That's when we saw the first light, a small, dull glow weaving through the tree line on the ridge east of us. It could have been another backpacker with a bad headlamp, but it didn't bounce like a flashlight. It bobbed, slow and steady, the way you'd picture a lantern carried on a long rope or someone's arm. We watched, half joking that maybe we should go say hi, but the light would disappear behind a tree and then, a few seconds later, reappear somewhere unexpected. Higher, lower, further left. No footsteps, no voices. After a while, a second lantern joined the first, moving parallel, winding through the trees with the same unnatural steadiness. Then a third. Daniel tried to film it, but the lights only showed as faint smudges, barely visible. "Locals out hunting," Mia said, trying to sound sure, but her tone told a different story. Or some weird Halloween thing? When we finally zipped into our tents, the cold was biting. I couldn't sleep. Sometime past midnight, I woke to a crisp, rhythmic crunching, like hooves. Not galloping, not heavy, just a deliberate clopping, as though horses walked single file across the frozen leaves. The sound circled our campsite, not close, but near enough to follow. I whispered from my tent, "Does anyone else hear that?" and held my breath. No one answered. It was as if only I was there. When I peeked outside, the air burned with cold. Further out, weaving between black tree trunks, the lanterns floated on. 5 now, glowing pale and honey yellow, but revealing nothing of whoever carried them. I could see no bodies, only the faint suggestion of shapes in the afterimage. Just emptiness behind the light, and always that quiet, measured sound of hooves, never quite in sync with the lights. I ducked back in, heart pounding, and waited for dawn. We spent the day in wary silence, everyone a little off, but we kept our plans and hiked to the next site. I asked if they had experienced something weird, unnatural, but nothing. It seemed like only I could see whatever was wrong. Settling in, but no one else did. That night, the pattern repeated. The lanterns appeared after dark, further off but more numerous, clustering and splitting, sometimes blinking out together as if swept by a single gust of wind we couldn't feel. This time I noticed something new. Thin, straight lines etched in the forest floor and on patches of raw earth, long and curving like the tracks of a wagon wheel or the drag of something heavy. The lines were dry, pale, as if drawn with bones. And then my eyes pointed out something unusual. The hoof falls this night weren't just circling. They crossed back and forth behind our tents, pausing in irregular intervals just out of sight. At one point, a faint metallic jingling chimed through the night, rising and falling as if something old and burdened was ambling through, unseen. The ground was too hard for prints, but in the morning, I found patches of grass pressed perfectly flat, lines of frost where none of us had walked, and trails of white stones lined up like dashes. Lines that ended abruptly at the edge of the clearing. Tori swore the frost marks spelled something. She thought she could make out the letter S, or maybe the number 8, but none of us were willing to look at them for long. Sleep eluded us again on the final night. The lanterns fanned out, arching in a semicircle around camp. The horses' footsteps never stopped. Sometimes the clopping faded almost out of earshot, only to suddenly sound right at our backs. Once, just before dawn, we all heard a deep snort of air, unmistakably equine and close enough that the tent walls shivered. I thought I felt warm breath, smelled damp hay and sweat, a scent far too real. Then it was gone, replaced by bitter cold. That morning I woke up earlier and saw them, at least a dozen circles in the frost, perfectly round, as if made by hooves pivoting again and again. In one of the circles was a single ancient horseshoe, brown with rust and inexplicably ice cold to the touch. We left early, packs hastily drawn, barely speaking until we'd made miles down the trail. I want to believe it was just someone out there, maybe a group of night riders, or some reenactment club holding silent vigils at midnight. But nobody heard human laughter, or voices, or anything to suggest that those lanterns and hooves belonged to people at all. Back home, sometimes when I wake in the dark, I hear that slow, measured clop fading somewhere far off, and I think of lights flickering in the trees. I never heard if anyone else saw the lanterns or the riders, but I still check the corners of every dark wood for shapes behind the light, and I never ever stay past dusk. Story number 7. I've always had a thing for wild swimming. Lakes, rivers, quarry pools. It doesn't matter. If I'm in the woods and there's water, I'll be the first one in, no matter how cold. So last September, during a long weekend camping trip to South Fork Lake with a few friends, I wasn't surprised to be the only one brave, or stupid, enough to wade in. The others, Matt, Jen, and Alina, sat on a fallen log, sunning themselves and laughing at me like usual. South Fork is hidden, way off the established trails, with water dark as obsidian thanks to tannins leaching from the surrounding pine. It was unseasonably warm, but the water hit like melting ice, sending needles up my legs. When I dove under, there was a moment of emptiness, just a cool hush, the thick taste of mossy water, and shafts of sunlight splintering above. The bottom dropped off fast, going from sandy underfoot to slipperier, muckier, then nothing at all. The first time it happened, I just surfaced, slicking my hair back, enjoying that rush. As I turned for the shore, something brushed my ankle under the surface. Not a fish, not the lazy tug of weeds. This was deliberate. The pressure was flat, cool, strangely soft, like small fingers, but far too many of them. And then I was drowning. It felt as if some invisible power was dragging me down into the water. I struggled for a while, and then everything went back to normal. I splashed and laughed it off, shouting for my friends to join. Jen yelled back, "You're nuts!" They looked bored, happy, already unwrapping sandwiches. But the touch, the feeling lingered with me, the unmistakable sense of a hand, or worse, hands. I glanced down into the shadow of my body on the water. Nothing there. I told myself it was nerves, a branch maybe, or a swirl of water. I let it go. But 10 minutes later, when I paddled out toward the fallen pine on the far shore, it happened again. This time, fingers, definite fingers, slid slickly over the arch of my foot. There was a chill, colder than lake water, and for a split second, a tug, gentle but insistent. Heart pounding, I kicked upward. The sensation vanished. I scanned the ripples, expecting to see something, anything. The surface was undisturbed. That's when I noticed there were no fish breaking the surface, no dragonflies flitting low. The lake felt empty, as though all its life had gone silent beneath that endless black. I heard Matt talking behind me on the shore, his voice weirdly far away. Convincing myself again, maybe eels, I thought, or super aggressive leeches. Still, I couldn't shake the idea of fingers, small, slight, but persistent, and too many. Every nerve screamed at me to get out, but pride kept me floating, forcing myself to appear unbothered. But on my third swim out, when I paused and treaded water, it felt like a dozen hands brushed over my calves, feather-light. In one agonizing moment, one latched coolly around my ankle. Not hard, but with a grip that was all wrong. The texture was rubbery and clammy, with a faint grit, and I swear I felt a nail or claw digging gently, almost with curiosity, into my skin. I gasped and thrashed, hacking and cursing. The grip let go instantly. As my thrashing subsided, the water stilled so fast it seemed unnatural, like I was suddenly floating in glass. For a breath, I thought I saw faint, pale shapes flickering deeper beneath me, small and slim, with long arms and heads that weren't quite round, more bulbous. I squeezed my eyes shut, refusing to look a second time. By the time I scrambled out, shaking, I tried to joke. My friends rolled their eyes. "Dude, you're acting weirder than usual," Matt said. Jen tossed me a towel and said I'd probably swum through a nest of frogs or driftwood. I checked my ankle and expected to see a bruise or scrape, but there was nothing, except a faint patch of skin gone slightly pale, like I'd pressed it against ice. The rest of the afternoon, the uneasy feeling clung to me. While eating, I kept catching scents on the air that didn't belong. Strong, earthy rot, riverweed, and sometimes the sharp, metallic tang of something more animal. I couldn't enjoy the warmth of the sun. The trees seemed to crowd closer, branches dipping, and, though I knew it was crazy, I kept feeling little cold drops on my feet, as if invisible hands dripped lake water onto my toes. That night, as we sat around the fire, Jen shrieked and pointed. There on the sand, a row of handprints, smaller than my palm, longer than a child's, pressed into the damp earth, each leading straight from the water toward the logs where I'd left my flip-flops. The distance between the fingers was wrong. Too wide, too many. Matt laughed it off, saying it must be raccoons, but the prints ended abruptly just a few feet from camp, not near any brush or roots, and there was a trail of black, stringy moss leading up from the lake. No one else saw or felt anything that night or the next. I spent both nights listening to distant, steady dripping. Never rain, just water drops, sometimes soft splashing from the shore, even though no one was near it. Sometimes I would swear as I tried to sleep that I heard a faint giggle or a soft sighing from the lake's direction. It could have just been wind and water, but it didn't feel that way. By morning, the handprints were gone, erased by dew or maybe just my overactive mind. But I've never swum in a wild lake since. When I dream of water now, I feel those hands, so many, so gently curious, still searching. Story number 8. Every September, my cousin Greg and his girlfriend Kelsey invite me on some Appalachian day hike they find online. This time it was one of those off-the-grid loops in the Blue Ridge, supposedly well-marked if you paid attention, but the type where the undergrowth eats the signage and even deer hesitate. Kelsey swears she saw it recommended by a local blogger, like a hidden passageway that feels older than the rest of the woods. I should have known better. We hit the trail after lunch. The woods were draped in late-season haze, yellowing leaves, clutching vines, and the subtle tang of rotting apples from an old orchard down in the valley. The first few miles went well. I kept pace, enjoying the quiet, but then something felt tilted. Light faded a bit, even though it wasn't cloudy, and the deeper we went, the fewer birds I heard. I called out a couple times, but Greg and Kelsey barely turned, just shrugged and urged us on. I started to notice things before they did. The trail, at first wide and welcoming, began to narrow, funneling us through tangled laurel tunnels. The path underfoot, which should have been dirt and rocks, started to feel spongy and wrong, soft like the decaying carpet of an abandoned house. Then we hit a dead end. I was the first to see it. The trail just stopped at a wall of densely packed willow and pine, and every single tree, from the saplings to the thick old trunks, bore slashing claw marks at eye level. Hundreds, maybe thousands. Some deep, almost splitting the wood. Some were fresh, oozing bright sap that stank of vinegar and sap rot. Where the bark split, it fanned open in shapes that looked like wide-open eyes glistening with the sticky tear of resin. No birds, no wind. Just the crunch of Greg's boots behind me. Kelsey giggled, but it was fake. There's gotta be a turn we missed. Greg grumbled and started combing the right-hand brush for blazes, but they didn't hear it. The low, rhythmic scraping, like claws or nails dragging over bark, somewhere deeper in the wall of trees. It started faint. Maybe a woodpecker, but then built to a rasp that throbbed in my teeth. Suddenly, I caught a whiff of something unmistakably foul. Sulfur, thick and heavy like a dead animal after rain, but sharper, almost electric on my tongue. I blinked. At the foot of the largest pine, growths of red-orange fungus wriggled in the split bark, arching up as if to reach the sunlight. The marks there seemed to move, the eyes in the bark shifting just slightly, all twitching in my direction. Trying not to gag, I looked away and tried my phone for the trail map. The screen flickered, whining with static for a split second, then forced shut. When I looked up, I realized my cousin and Kelsey had gone quiet. They stood together, maybe 10 feet away, staring at an old cairn of river stones, stacked unnaturally perfect, each stone daubed with a black, oily smear. For a moment, I thought they hadn't breathed for ages. Their faces were flat and slack. I tried to speak, but my teeth felt wrong, buzzing. Greg finally shook himself and said we should head back, and both Kelsey and I didn't say much as we turned. But something was off. The path didn't look right, retracing our steps. Stones I remembered as round were suddenly sharp-edged. Tree branches drooped lower and seemed to grab my jacket as I passed. The sunlight was even paler, tinged with green. Then it started. At each fork in the trail, I'd glance left or right and catch sight of a blackened stump, split wide and oozing what looked like tar. At one, a burst of crows shot up, black feathers drifting down like ash. Greg and Kelsey barreled along, talking about camping meals, oblivious. But every time I glanced behind me, I saw things out of place. A child's rubber boot half buried under moss, a broken ceramic doll's head under a cluster of bleeding mushrooms. Things that shouldn't be there. Each seemed pointed toward the trail, watching. My heart hammered. I tried to breathe, but the sulfur smell kept returning, sharper with every step. I started to hear soft whispers threading from the trees. My name, or what could be my name, hissed and repeated until I couldn't tell if it was inside or outside my head. The others plowed ahead, untouched. For the last half-mile, the trail seemed to double back on itself, looping us through the same cluster of slashed trees 3 times. The mark at my eye level now looked like a jaw, grinning with sap-dripping teeth. Greg said I looked pale, that maybe I'd picked up some bug, but his face flickered oddly at the edge of my vision, the outlines swimming greenish and thin. When we finally spilled out near the trailhead, my phone buzzed alive and the smell faded. Greg and Kelsey were arguing about dinner, oblivious. The forest behind us had closed in, pathless and dense. No wind, no sound. I lied about what I saw. Didn't mention the scratches, the fungus, the doll head, the voices. I figure maybe I was dehydrated, maybe a migraine was kicking in. That's what I told myself anyway. But I don't want to walk that part of the mountain again, even now. Some woods, it seems, lay their own dead ends, which you might never leave behind, even once you're out. Story number 9. I've always noticed the birds, how their sound fills up the day, how you expect that noisy flutter and squawk when you're deep in the woods. So our Memorial Day weekend trip into Pine Hollow was doomed to be weird the second I stepped out of the Jeep and realized how quiet it was. Not just normal quiet, but a kind of vacuum. No twittering, no woodpecker bursts, not a single faraway hawk call. Just the breeze and the crunch of our boots. The rest of the guys didn't seem to care. Ryan killed the ignition, grinned at Calvin and Drew, and started hauling out gear. "Come on, Tyson," he called. "Next time you'll pick the spot." The campsite was nice enough. Ferns grew in thick patches, moss blanketed every fallen log, and wild blackberries lined the banks of the creek nearby. It should have been full of birds, bugs, the whine of mosquitoes, but all I could hear was wind. Even as we set up the tents, built a fire ring, drank beers. At first I figured it was timing, maybe too late in the morning, maybe a storm had just passed. Who knows? But it bugged me. The afternoon passed. I wandered up the ridge looking for some sign of animal life. I saw the odd squirrel, but never heard a single chirp. Everyone else was joking, tossing a frisbee. Sometimes I caught them glancing at me, wondering why I was so distracted. Late in the day, something changed. There was a sudden thud, like something giant had dropped from the trees or slammed into the ground nearby. It was heavy, enough to shudder the dirt under my feet and kill all laughter at the camp. "Did you guys feel that?" I asked on edge. "Probably a log breaking somewhere," Calvin shrugged. We walked the perimeter, expecting to see a tree split in half or a boulder that had rolled. But there was nothing. No crash, no broken branches, just undisturbed bracken and more silence. That evening, as the sky went orange and then blue, Drew pointed out how nice it was to not hear crickets. "It's like a Zen garden," he joked, not noticing the way the hair stood up on my arms. As dusk slipped in and we sat by the campfire, things got stranger. I'd set my tent close to the creek, and when I went to grab something, I heard a faint flutter overhead, then a soft thud right above my tent. I looked up, expecting to see leaves or maybe a bat, but nothing moved. Another thud, closer, on top of the nylon. It literally made the tent whip down, then pop back up like something had landed. But there was no mark, no shadow, no creature. I unzipped and stuck my head out, expecting to surprise a raccoon or even an owl, but the empty sky just pulsed with the last bits of twilight. I told myself it had to be wind or acorns, or maybe I'd missed a moth bumping into the tent. I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched by something above, just out of sight. Later, when everyone else turned in, I couldn't find sleep. My mind kept circling the absence of birds. Every sound I heard, every creak from the trees or snap in the underbrush, felt amplified, out of place in the hush. As I stared up at the mesh roof, I thought I saw shapes swirling above the tent, just for a second. Dark, almost bird-like, but more like holes in the sky than actual animals. The next moment I figured it had to be cloud shadows, or my mind playing tricks. At some point I drifted off. A cold chill woke me before dawn. I heard light flapping, delicate, but too heavy for bats or small birds, circling just outside the tent. Muffled thuds, again on the nylon, then something like a beak tapping, slow and deliberate, right above my head 5 times. I laid there, frozen. The sound faded, replaced again by silence so absolute I felt it crushing my ears. Just as light began to creep through the trees, I ventured outside. The air was sour, laced with a strange metallic tang I'd never smelled before. All three of my friends were asleep. Around each of our tents, perfect circles had formed, rings of scattered feathers, not loose but arranged, beak marks pressed into the dirt at intervals. I looked at the feathers, soft, downy, slick with dew, none matching any bird I knew. Some were jet black, others a pale, translucent gray, almost like fish skin. The beak marks were long, sharp, pointed just inwards toward the tents. I tried waking the others, but of course, by then, some of the impressions had already faded, and the feathers looked like windblown debris if you weren't paying attention. Nobody else had heard anything, not even the thuds. Calvin said the missing birds were just seasonal, that maybe we'd stumbled into some place where the birds didn't find any suitable habitat. But that was no logic to cool my nerves down, knowing what I had experienced. My mind couldn't rest any explanation as to why or how was it possible for not a single bird to fly over this part. Drew said the feathers and marks were probably from wild turkeys or a fox with a kill. I wanted to believe them, tried to, but the feeling in the woods didn't lift. The silence grew heavier each hour, and I kept checking the sky, waiting for a hawk or even a crow, something to break the spell. We packed out a day early, and the stillness hung on us. On me, most probably, all the way back to the car. At night, sometimes I can hear the weird sensations, majorly something circling above me in my room while I am asleep. The creepiest thing is to be the shrill echo that I hear coming from somewhere which is close to me, but I still can't make up the part it comes from. It is as if whatever was in the woods haven't left me, and instead has followed me back to me house. The echo of a thud that shakes the earth without leaving any trace haunts me still to the date. I haven't heard a single bird since that trip, not even at home. Suspiciously weird, but maybe I just stopped noticing. Maybe they notice me now, the they in question. Story number 10. Last July, my older brother dragged me and a few friends to Blue Rock State Forest for a quiet weekend. He and his crew were all about fishing and soaking up beers by the fire, so I joined mostly for the isolation, not realizing how true that would turn out. Our campsite was nothing special, but on the second evening, I noticed the tree. It was maybe 15 yards off the edge of the site, alone in a clearing, bigger than others around it, gnarled like something out of a children's book. Bark ridged and black, hunched in a weird stooping way. I remember thinking it looked almost embarrassed, standing by itself, arms tangled above the grass. The air was thick and golden as the sun started to dip. That's when I heard it, a deep, steady hum, just at the edge of hearing. It was too even to be wind, and it wasn't a bug. Nobody else seemed to notice. I stepped closer, and the sound got clearer, almost like a giant cello string held at a single note. My chest vibrated. With every step toward the tree, the feeling grew, not just in my ears, but in my jaw and ribs. A bass drone, as if something in the wood was alive, singing in its sleep. When I touched the bark, it felt strangely warm, almost pulsing beneath my palm. I lingered, listening. The air tasted of pollen and old stone, metallic, sweet. I backed away, feeling lightheaded. My friends called me back, and the sound faded as suddenly as it started. That night, as we sat around the fire, my attention kept slipping to the shadowed shape of the tree. The hum was gone, but now and then I thought I heard sighs and a delicate clicking, like fingernails inside hollow wood. When bedtime came, I tried to laugh it off, blaming the beer. Sleep didn't come easy. I had been trying to sleep, but that's when I heard the humming again. Every nerve in my body told me not to go, but the sound seemed to drift me. I saw the tree from my tent. Everyone else was asleep, the fire, now nearly lighting the area. And that's when, two golden lights, as if it was watching me. I heard a small gnarl as I saw the tree, its eyes looking straight at me. For a moment I started walking off, but then I heard my brother's call, and when I snapped, I was almost about to reach near the tree. I ran from there as fast as I could. I went back to sleep, not trusting any sound. Past midnight, I had finally dozed off. But then, I awoke to a gentle pressure on my arms and chest, like a dozen twigs pressing down softly. The tent glowed blue from the moon, and I could smell grass and dusty sap. Somewhere close, too close, I heard the hum again, pure and resonant, vibrating the tent poles. Then it was gone, replaced by the slow, rasping scratching across tent fabric. By morning, I chalked all of it to weird dreams. But when I unzipped and stepped out, my arms ached and my shirt was dusted with bits of pollen and green flecks. There were faint red marks around my biceps, as if branches with fresh shoots had rested on me while I slept. I brushed myself off, a little disturbed, and wandered to grab water. On the way, I caught sight of the base of the humming tree, today streaked with new marks. Thin, curling etchings spiraled up the trunk, faint but wet, as if freshly scored with something sharp. When I knelt down, I saw little mounds of dirt. Roots pushed upwards, and scattered within were bits of old cloth, dried out to gray, some oddly familiar. My pulse jumped. I pulled at one, only for it to crumble in my hand, releasing a gust of sweet, rotten air. The rest of the group was oblivious. Over breakfast, I tried to mention it. "That old tree makes noise. I swear it does." They rolled their eyes, cracked jokes, and moved on. But as the sun dipped again, the hum returned, low and gentle. It was as if the tree was gnarling, hungry, waiting for something. But no one else so much as flinched. That evening, I made a point to stay away, but the sound crawled under my skin. When I tried to sleep, the dreams came back, of me going towards the tree. I saw the golden eyes, too real for a dream. It felt as if I was right in front of the tree, its eyes watching me, low snarls rolling as I stood there barefoot. It was the sound of the twig when I realized that I was in front of the tree again, this time a little far, its eyes watching me. God, only I know how I came back. The tent was a lot colder than before. I barely managed to sleep, and that's when I'd feel cold, sticky twigs sliding into my sleeping bag, wrapping loosely around my legs, oozing clear sap that left a faint burn. I woke drenched in sweat, tangled in tiny green twigs that hadn't been there when I zipped the bag. My skin itched. When I checked my pack, I found leaves and bits of pollen, twigs stashed between my clothes as if someone or something had packed them there. The hum pulsed through the dawn, and I knew it meant for me to listen. I was sure of it. We left a day early, but as we drove away, I looked back and the tree leaned toward the path, its branches rustling though no wind was blowing. The hum stayed in my chest the entire drive home, playing on my nerves. Sometimes while sleeping, I would see those golden eyes watching me, the presence too close, as if it were leaning in my room. I haven't told anyone about this, not even to my brother. He would probably laugh, but me being in front of the tree, I don't think I would ever be able to be around trees at night. It seemed like the tree had captured me, unless I left. Some things, I think, are meant for certain ears. Story number 11. I camp often, more than most. I like the deep woods, the kind that swallow sound so even your breath feels like an intrusion. Last May, I joined my friend Tyler's group for a 3-night stay in Ouachita. There were 5 of us, all pretty seasoned, though only I really preferred solitude. Maybe that's why, when the weirdness started, nobody else noticed. On the first night, after the usual rounds of cheap whiskey and stories, we let the fire burn down low and drifted off to our tents. That's when I saw it, a faint line of pale stones, oddly round and unweathered, seeming to glow with dew. They snaked away from the fire pit, heading east into the underbrush, perfectly straight. I figured someone from a previous group had made a marker or an old trick to point to a creek, so I ignored it. The next morning I brought it up. "You guys see those rocks?" Tyler shrugged, told me I'd probably drop something while gathering kindling. Drew joked, "Dude, your night vision is just beer goggles." When I went to show them, the stones were gone. In their place, dense ferns, unbroken and dew-soaked. Night 2, I turned in early. Restless, I stuck my head out of my tent and saw it again. This time, not stones, but a trail, narrower than a game path, clear as a drawn line under the moonlight. Trees to either side had strips of pale bark, almost luminous, like the trail had been burned into place. I stared for a while, expecting someone to walk by, but even Tyler's tent was zipped and silent. I'm not one to spook easy. I kept telling myself it was just a trick of light and tiredness, but there was something inviting, almost beckoning about that path. I nearly stepped onto it, except my boots were still drying by the fire, or so I thought. When I checked, one boot was missing. I found it sitting on the edge of the new trail, perfectly upright, toe pointed into that pale direction. I grabbed the boot, heart hammering, sure that if I looked up, I'd see eyes in the dark. But it was only me, the wind, and the impossibly silent path. Chilled, I went back to bed. In the morning, I again went to find proof, but no path, just thick leaf litter and uninterrupted undergrowth. My boot, despite retrieval, was caked with mud and small sharp stones stuck in the tread, as if it had gone for a walk without me. A sliver of pale bark, matching the trees from the night before, was wedged into the heel. The others dismissed it. Probably stepped in it yesterday by accident. Day 3 was the worst. Everyone else hiked a loop out to some waterfall. My ankle was sore, so I stayed at camp with a book. As dusk fell, a damp, earthy cold crept through the trees and mist crawled low. When I stood to collect wood, my water bottle was missing. I found it 50 yards away, at the start of the same narrow path, except now the path shimmered, wet in the last sliver of sunlight, and I could see impressions leading along it, marks like scuffed boots, but too narrow, too neat to be mine. I tried to walk away but felt watched, the hairs on my arms buzzing. Halfway back to camp, I heard a single clear whistle. 3 notes, familiar like my father used to call the dog when I was a kid. It came from deep down the path. My mouth went dry. No one else in the group would know that tune. I called for Tyler and the rest, but only the woods replied, heavy as a storm. The path seemed longer now, disappearing into dense brush, impossible as it hadn't been there that morning. Worse, when I lit my headlamp, small objects glinted back at me along the trail. My headlamp case, the enamel mug from my bag, my own multi-tool, all placed precisely in a line, each damp with dew despite my having last seen them zipped in my tent. My mug was filled with surface-scummed creek water, and the headlamp, though brand new, flickered weakly, as if its batteries were drained. That night, things felt completely wrong. Dew crept under the fly of my tent, pooling in a cold ring around my pad. I heard movement, soft footsteps and quiet rattling, always just beyond the fabric wall. I kept smelling a mossy, fungal rot mixed with a faint metallic tang, like blood or wet tin. The more I tried to ignore it, the louder the whistle returned, always those 3 haunting notes, echoing from the direction of that hidden path. It began to sound less like a whistle and more like a voice muttering through cupped hands. By dawn, a fog had settled, muffling everything. There was no path, no line of stones or strips of peeled bark. My mug was back at the fire, but the bottom felt slimy and left a reddish stain on my fingers I couldn't scrub off. When the others returned, I tried to explain, but it only earned raised eyebrows and a few harmless jabs. Maybe exhaustion or stress explains it all. Maybe raccoons or some backwoods pranksters snuck in just for fun. But sometimes I catch movement out of the corner of my eye. A line leading away, promising a path only I can see, and the distant echo of my father's tune, calling me off into the dark where nothing ought to be. Story number 12. I've been camping for years and thought I'd seen every way the woods can unsettle you. The isolation, the sounds at night, the tricks your mind will play after too many hours of silence. But there's a night from last autumn's trip to the Klamath Hills that still keeps me up, because sometimes the things you can't explain are trapped in the smallest places. I was out with 3 friends, Leah, Sam, and Mark. They're the type that bring little luxuries, Sam's enamel coffee pot, Leah's vintage flashlight, Mark's collapsible mirror for basic hygiene. I always rolled my eyes at that, but on the first night, after a long hike and some canned chili, I actually borrowed it, my face needing a check after I walked through a sticky spiderweb in the dusk. It was dusk, and the campfire spat blue smoke. I found the mirror on the picnic table. The glass smeared a little. When I angled it, I nearly yelped. For a second, I saw someone's face staring back. Not mine. The features were wrong. Too thin, mouth curled tight, dried streaks at the corners like old tears. The eyes were mine though. My color, my shape, just warped. I blinked and the image scattered, my own normal face settling in. I laughed, called myself jumpy, and figured it was just the weird evening light and the sleep-deprived bags under my eyes. But that night, after everyone else fell asleep, I went to the creek to brush my teeth. My phone screen was dark and reflective. Cup of water in one hand, I bent to rinse and froze. The glare on the water was like glass, and my reflection smiled, slow and deliberate, even though my mouth was shut. Water dripped from the twins' chin, even though I hadn't leaned in that far. Chills prickled across my whole back. I snapped upright, splashing water everywhere, but the creek rushed on like nothing happened. Back at camp, everyone was out cold. I pretended nothing was wrong, tried to blame it on nerves, but every reflective surface felt like a trap. My water bottle, anodized and shiny, flashed another wrong face as I unscrewed the cap. I squeezed my eyes shut. When I opened them, it was just me, drawn and pale. Before bed, I forced myself to check the mirror again. There, in the haze of moonlight, my face stared back, and then blinked, out of sync. Like a bad video call buffering, my reflection's right eyelid drooped slowly, seconds before I realized mine hadn't moved. The smile was back, too wide and quivering at the edges. Sleep that night was impossible. I tossed in my bag, haunted by the memory of that offbeat blink and the smile that wouldn't fade. Around 3 a.m., something woke me. A rustle, or maybe the wind. On impulse, I clicked on my phone and caught the black screen's reflection again, expecting anything. There it was, my face pressed in close, the lips mouthing words my ears couldn't hear. I choked down a cry, my pulse thundering. I snapped the phone shut and flung it into the bottom of the sleeping bag, like that might force the image away. I spent the rest of the night staring at the nylon ceiling, listening to the sound of my friend's breathing, of slight movements in the underbrush. Every tiny sound made me wonder if a reflection could ever slip free from the surface. Next morning, my nerves were shot. Mark found his mirror folded shut with muddy fingerprints across the shiny side. "Who the hell touched this?" he said. I played dumb, using a bottle to rinse my face and managing not to look. At breakfast, I nervously avoided all shining objects. Even the coffee pot looked suspicious. Leah noticed my edge. "Bad sleep?" she asked. "Nightmares? Or?" Her face was soft and ordinary, real as earth. But later, when I glanced at the pot after she poured coffee, I thought I saw a streak of red at the corner of my reflected mouth. When I dabbed my lips, nothing came away. When Sam broke out a backup phone to take a group pic on the last morning, he laughed. "Man, you look like you just saw a ghost." In the image, my face was blurry compared to everyone else's. Eyes overbright, mouth pinched. He joked about bad pixelation. I never told the others. A few days after returning home, I caught myself hesitating by windows, by the gleam of spoons, by puddles after rain. I sometimes see a faint mistake in the reflection. Mouth just a little too wide, a half smile blooming with no reason at all. It always disappears if I stare straight into it, but now I never keep mirrors in my tent, and I avoid the sheen of my phone at night like it might show me something I can't unsee or ever explain. Maybe it was just exhaustion and nerves, tricks of angle and bad light. That, or something in the woods learning how to smile like me, blink like me, waiting for a time I finally look away. Story number 13. We were 3 guys, me, Nate, and Drew, camping in the Mount Hood National Forest in Oregon last fall. Nothing special, just a long weekend off-grid, hiking, beers, firewood, the usual. We've done trips like this every year since college. No phones, no GPS, no tech except a weather radio and a flashlight each. We set up near a bend in a river, maybe a half-mile from the nearest marked trail. The area was quiet, but not eerily so, just the normal rustling of animals and a breeze in the trees. Honestly, it was kind of perfect. On the second day, I was out looking for dry kindling when I noticed this narrow game trail winding away from the river, like a tunnel through the bush. It was weirdly defined, not like most messy deer trails. The leaves were flattened in a single path, and every so often I saw these claw marks, not deep but fresh. Too wide for a dog, too shallow for a bear. Maybe cougar, I thought. I called for the guys, but they were back near camp, cooking up trout from the river. I stood at the trailhead for a while, debating whether to explore. Eventually, curiosity won, and I walked in. It got quiet real fast. I don't mean like peaceful quiet. I mean dead quiet. The kind of silence where you can hear the blood pulsing in your ears. No wind, no birds, not even the distant rush of the river. Just me and the crunch of twigs under my boots. About 10 minutes in, I found a deer carcass, half covered in moss. But it didn't smell. No rot, no flies. It looked preserved. And here's the part that still messes with me. The eyes were intact, wide open, not cloudy, just glassy, and staring like it had died an hour ago. But its torso was caved in, like it had been dead for days. I turned around immediately and hustled back to camp, tried not to look like I was shaken. I told the guys I found some fur, maybe bobcat, and they just shrugged it off. That night, something started pacing near our tents. It was just me who heard it. Nate and Drew were passed out cold after whiskey and fire-roasted fish. I laid there in my sleeping bag, every hair on my arm standing up. Whatever it was, it didn't crunch through leaves like a bear would. It stepped deliberately, 1 foot, pause, then another. It circled my tent 3 times. I held my breath until the 4th lap, when the pacing just stopped. I waited another hour before I dared unzip the flap and peek out. Nothing. Just the dying fire and moonlight on the river. The next morning, I noticed something off near my tent. A stick figure. It was maybe 10 inches tall, made of twisted twigs and tied together with fraying fishing line, propped against the tree I'd pissed on the night before. Neither of the guys saw it until I pointed it out. Drew thought it was a prank. Nate said it was probably some kid's art project that blew in from a campsite downriver. But we hadn't seen or heard anyone since we arrived. Not one human. No tire tracks, no planes overhead, nothing. That evening, I went back to the trail just for a minute. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that it was just wildlife and my brain playing tricks. The same silence greeted me, except now the deer was gone. I checked the area, nothing disturbed, not even blood where it had been, just a clean patch of dirt and moss like it was never there. I didn't go further, I didn't even walk. I backed away, slow, like something was watching. And I swear, right before I turned around, I felt something shift behind the trees. Not movement, displacement, like air being pushed aside. That night it came back. I was still awake, lying stiff with dread, when I heard it again. The steps. Same pattern, slow, deliberate, heavy. But this time it didn't circle. It stopped right beside my tent. I stared at the fabric wall 6 inches from my face, and I swear on my life, I saw the silhouette of a hand, long fingers, too long, press into the nylon. It didn't claw. It traced, from top to bottom, then side to side, like it was feeling for a zipper. And then it whispered, not words, just a dry breath dragging across the material. I nearly pissed myself. Then, silence. It left. Just like that. The next morning, I told the guys I wasn't feeling great. I didn't mention the hand. I didn't mention the deer. I just wanted to get the hell out. But we had one more night to go, and I didn't want to be the paranoid killjoy. That day, I barely left the campsite, just sat near the fire pit, twitching at every gust of wind. Around noon, Drew went to wash dishes in the river and shouted for us. On the bank, someone, or something, had arranged rocks in a perfect spiral, maybe 10 feet across, each stone smooth, flat, the same size. None of them had been there the night before. In the center of the spiral was another stick figure, but this one was bigger, waist high, same fraying fishing line, but now with a scrap of fabric tied around the neck. No idea how did it go there, but something felt off. We all laughed it off, said it was weird. Maybe someone really was camping nearby and trying to freak us out. But then maybe I knew better. That last night I didn't sleep, not a second. Neither did whatever was pacing again, this time along the outside perimeter of our whole camp. I packed up at dawn, didn't wait for breakfast, didn't say much. I just wanted to go. As we hiked back to the car, we passed that game trail again. I glanced in and froze. 20 feet in, just barely visible through the undergrowth, stood the stick figure. The big one. Just standing there, facing the trail, like it had walked there on its own. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined it all. Stress, no sleep, too much whiskey. Maybe it was just kids messing with us. Maybe animals really do step like that. Maybe the deer dragged itself off somehow. But I've been on a dozen camping trips since, and I never leave the trail anymore. Story number 14. This happened 3 summers ago in Colorado, up near the San Juan Mountains. Me, my brother Sam, and our friend Micah took a 4-day backpacking trip to disconnect. We were all in our early 30s, used to the outdoors and familiar with the area. We'd been coming up here since we were kids. We picked a spot near a ridge that overlooked a glacial stream. Isolated, quiet, no other hikers around. We had to hike 7 miles off the Forest Service road just to get there. It was perfect. The first night was uneventful, chilly, lots of stars, nothing weird. We roasted hot dogs over the fire, cracked a few beers, and passed out in our tents. It was the second night when things got off. It started around 11 p.m. I was awake, lying in my sleeping bag with the flap of my tent unzipped so I could stare at the sky. The moon was bright, casting silver light across the tree canopy. That's when I noticed them. Small, pale blue lights floating in the trees, about 15, maybe 20 feet above the ground. There were 3 at first, then 5, then more. They didn't flicker like fireflies. They moved slowly, smoothly, like they were gliding, weaving between the branches. I propped myself up on my elbows, blinking to make sure I wasn't dreaming. The lights had no beam, no source, no reflection. Just soft glowing spheres, like floating glass marbles filled with cold light. I thought maybe drones, but they were silent. No buzzing, no wind disturbance. And they moved with strange coordination. Not like machines, more like they were watching something. I whispered to Sam from my tent, but he didn't respond. He's a heavy sleeper. Same with Micah. I thought about waking them up, but something held me back. A gut feeling I can't explain. It wasn't fear exactly, more like awe mixed with dread. Like I was seeing something I wasn't supposed to. I watched the lights for what felt like 15, maybe 20 minutes. Then one by one, they started to blink out. Not like flicking off a switch, more like being swallowed by the dark. The last one hovered directly above my tent, unmoving, and then winked out like it had never been there. The silence that followed was deafening. No wind, no insects, not even the water from the stream. Just stillness, like the forest was holding its breath. I lay back down and didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I asked Sam and Micah if they saw anything strange. They both gave me blank looks and said no. I figured maybe I dreamed it. I even half believed it, until that afternoon. We'd gone to refill our water bottles at the stream when Micah suddenly called us over. In the dirt near our tents, there were impressions. Not footprints exactly. More like round, shallow depressions. Dozens of them. Each about the size of a baseball, sunk into the ground in perfect circles. Not animal tracks, not boot prints. Just indents. Sam joked they were alien crop circles and laughed it off. I laughed too, but my skin felt tight and cold. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept my flashlight in my hand and lay stiff in my bag, listening. Around 2 a.m. it came back. Not the lights. This time it was sound. A low rhythmic whirring, like dozens of small propellers spinning at once, but muffled, distant, and above us. It didn't get louder or closer. It just pulsed in the air overhead, as if something massive was hovering out of view. I unzipped my tent as quietly as I could and peeked out. Nothing. No lights. No movement. The trees stood still in the moonlight, but the sound didn't stop. It stayed there, above us, for maybe 10 minutes. Then it cut off all at once, mid-cycle, like someone had pulled the plug. I waited. No more sounds, no more lights. Just silence again. I didn't sleep. I didn't tell the others either. I was starting to think I was losing it. We packed up camp the next morning to move to a new spot closer to the ridge. As we hiked out, I turned to look back at our site one last time. In the dirt behind my tent, where I'd laid awake both nights. Something had been scratched into the ground. 3 concentric circles, each about the size of a dinner plate, dug precisely into the soil. Sam and Micah hadn't seen it. I didn't point it out. That night at the new site, everything felt off. The air was thicker. The bugs didn't come out. Even the birds were quiet. Sam and Micah noticed it too, but we brushed it off. Told ourselves it was just the change in elevation. I lay awake again, heart pounding. Around 1:30 a.m., I heard faint clicking sounds, like someone tapping fingernails against bark. I sat up slowly, flashlight in hand, and unzipped the tent. At the tree line, maybe 30 feet away, something was standing behind a pine, just barely visible, a sliver of a pale shape. No detail, no movement. It ducked out of view when my light hit it. I stepped out and scanned the trees, but there was nothing. No footprints, no broken twigs, just that awful, thick silence again. We left the next morning, cut the trip short. I told them I was sick, and they didn't argue. Back home, I checked online, searched everything from swamp gas to drone swarms to ball lightning. There were a few accounts, people seeing blue orbs in wooded areas, feeling watched, hearing strange mechanical sounds, but nothing definitive, no answers, just scattered anecdotes like mine. Most of them ended with the same phrase, "I never went back." Sometimes I wonder if it was just exhaustion or some weird atmospheric phenomenon. That's what I tell myself, that it was a hallucination, or maybe I had a fever and imagined the whole thing. But then I remember those perfect circles, the hovering sound that vibrated inside my chest, and the figure behind the tree just out of reach. I still go hiking, but not at night, not near tree lines, and never in silence. Story number 15. This happened about 10 years ago during a camping trip in the mountains of West Virginia. There were 4 of us, me, my cousin Jeremy, his girlfriend Katie, and our friend Tyler. We were in our 20s, cocky, underprepared, and chasing that sweet, disconnected from civilization feeling we only got a few times a year. We'd hiked for 2 days, veering off marked trails to find a patch of wilderness we could call our own. Eventually, we set up camp in a small wooded bowl nestled beneath a ridge near a narrow stream. No one for miles, just the sound of birds in the wind. On the second afternoon, while the others were napping, I went to look for dry firewood. I wandered farther than I meant to, maybe half a mile from camp, when I saw it, a clearing tucked behind a cluster of pines, and in that clearing stood a cabin. At first, I thought I was hallucinating. It looked ancient, log walls warped and graying, the roof sagging under years of rot and neglect. But the door was chained shut with a thick, rusted link. The windows were covered in wooden slats, nailed shut from the inside. I stepped closer. The air around it was still, not quiet like the rest of the forest, still like time had stopped. No bird song, no wind. Even the tree branches stood motionless. I crept to one of the window slats and peeked through a gap. My stomach did a little backflip. Inside, the cabin was pristine. A table sat in the center of the room, set for a meal. 4 chairs, 4 plates, old-fashioned silverware, candlesticks with wax melted halfway down. Dust coated everything, but it wasn't disturbed. It looked like someone had set the table and then vanished without touching a single thing. I didn't tell the others right away. I don't know why. Maybe I felt like I'd intruded on something I shouldn't have seen. I told myself it was just an old hunter's cabin left behind decades ago. Still, I couldn't shake that feeling of being watched as I walked back to camp. That night, I couldn't sleep. The woods didn't sound right. The trees creaked like they were shifting, leaning maybe, though there wasn't any wind. At around 2 a.m., I sat up in my tent, straining to hear. That's when I noticed it, a soft clinking sound, like silverware tapping on a plate. I froze. It was coming from the trees. I waited, heart pounding, then unzipped the tent and shone my flashlight into the dark. Nothing. The sound stopped instantly. I stayed awake until dawn. The next morning, I finally told the others about the cabin. Jeremy laughed, said we had to check it out. I said I'd show them after breakfast. But when we got back to the clearing, it wasn't there. We retraced my steps. The terrain was right. The angle of the stream, the pines. but the clearing was just thick forest. No path, no break in the trees, just a wall of bark and green. I felt cold, dizzy. I swore I wasn't making it up, but the more I tried to describe the cabin, the more absurd it sounded. Tyler said maybe I dreamed it. Katie thought I'd stumbled onto an old moonshiner spot and mixed up the location. No one was cruel about it, just dismissive. That night, the weirdness returned. While we were sitting by the fire laughing about something Jeremy said, a clink rang out from the edge of the woods. It was faint but sharp, like a fork tapping against porcelain. I looked at the others. No one reacted. I said, "Did you guys hear that?" Jeremy raised an eyebrow. "Hear what?" I stood up, flashlight already in hand, and scanned the tree line. Nothing, no animals, no wind. But when I turned off the light and walked back to the fire, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A plate, lying in the dirt just behind my tent. Old white ceramic with faded blue flowers on the edge. The same pattern I'd seen inside the cabin. I didn't touch it. The next morning it was gone. I asked if any of them had moved it, and they just stared at me like I was messing with them. Tyler even asked if I'd been sneaking Zaza at night. I tried to laugh it off, but something inside me knew. Something was following me. We packed up the next morning to hike out early. I stayed at the back of the group, too distracted to enjoy the scenery. As we passed a break in the trees, I looked to my right. There it was, the cabin, standing silently in a clearing we hadn't passed before. But this time the front door was open. No chain, just ajar, enough to see the edge of the set table and a candle now burned down to a stub. I stopped walking. My stomach turned to ice. One of the chairs was pulled out, as if waiting. I turned to call the others. But the second I looked away, the clearing was just trees again. Dense, unbroken forest. I didn't say anything. What would I say? "Hey guys, the haunted cabin just peeked at me again?" No thanks. We made it back to the car that afternoon. I kept my mouth shut the whole way home. I've never gone back to that part of the forest. Sometimes when I lie in bed at night, I hear faint clinks. Just once, maybe twice, like metal on porcelain. I tell myself it's just the pipes or distant street noise. But once, a few weeks after the trip, I woke up to find a scrap of wax paper on my nightstand. Yellowed, brittle, like something from a butcher's shop in the 1940s. It smelled faintly of ashes and lavender. My bedroom window was still locked from the inside. Story number 16. This happened last August in the Mark Twain National Forest, Missouri. I went camping with my older cousin Dan and his girlfriend Marla. 3 nights in a remote forested stretch near a stream, far from any maintained trail. It was supposed to be relaxing, detox from the noise of the world. Ironically, noise ended up being the one thing I couldn't escape. It started after the storm. On our second evening, clouds rolled in fast. Thunder cracked, and within 20 minutes, we were rushing to tarp the tents and stash our gear. The rain hit hard. No lightning strikes nearby, but the sky lit up like strobe lights for an hour. Eventually it passed, and we dried off by the fire, half laughing about it. That night, I fell asleep with the faint sound of dripping trees. I woke up around 3 a.m., needing to pee. As I stepped out of my tent, I noticed something weird. The air felt charged, like when you rub a balloon on your arm. My arm hairs stood up. There was no wind, just a faint pressure in the air, as if something invisible was pushing gently on everything. And then I heard it, a low static hum. It wasn't coming from inside my head. I turned in place and the volume subtly shifted depending on which direction I faced. Louder toward the tree line. I thought it might be water still dripping from leaves onto something metallic, or maybe a cicada buzz I wasn't used to. I finished peeing and went back into the tent, trying to shake it off, but the static didn't stop. It was faint but constant, not white noise exactly, more like what you'd hear from an old analog TV on a dead channel, far away. In the morning, I asked Dan if he heard anything weird during the night. He just said, "You mean the owl?" Thing was loud as hell. I nodded, but there was no owl. No bird calls at all, now that I thought about it. When we packed up to hike to a higher ridge, I grabbed my flashlight, which had been sitting out all night. The moment I picked it up, I felt a sharp zap, like a static shock, but stronger, enough to make me drop it. The others laughed it off. Too much metal after a storm, Dan said. I tried to believe that. That night, we set up camp higher up near a grove of hickory trees. No sign of another storm. Clear skies, stars out. Everything felt normal until I stepped a few feet away from the fire to grab my backpack. The static came back. Louder now. It wasn't in my ears, it was in the air. It surrounded me, the way heat from a stove radiates. I turned my head slowly, and it shifted again. Louder when I faced the trees, quieter when I faced the fire. I called out to Dan and Marla and asked, "You guys hear that?" They looked up. "Hear what?" I stood there frozen for a moment, then laughed it off. Nothing. Thought I heard a squirrel or something. Later, lying in my tent, the static didn't fade. It grew sharper. Not louder exactly, but more defined. I could hear faint patterns in it. Pulses, clicks, almost like speech buried under layers of distortion. And that's when I noticed the flashlight again. It was buzzing. The metal casing, lying by the zipper, was humming faintly against the tent fabric. It sounded like it was alive. When I picked it up, it burned my fingertips, but the batteries were removed. I'd taken them out earlier that evening to use in my GPS. I didn't sleep. Next morning, I showed the flashlight to Dan. It was cold by then, inert. "Dude, you're freaking yourself out," he said. "Residual charge or something. We got zapped all the time back in welding school." Maybe. But I started watching everything more closely. That day, the fire sparked in odd ways. We barely had it going, just a few dry twigs and pine needles. But suddenly it flared, hard, with this crack, like a short circuit. The flames arced strangely, flaring sideways before calming. Marla blamed the kindling. That evening, I wandered a little outside camp with my camera to take sunset shots. I snapped a few and then paused. Everything felt still. Then came a low pop in my ears, like cabin pressure shifting on a plane, and all sound vanished. No wind, no birds, no stream. Just a thick wall of nothing. Then the static returned, loud and immediate, vibrating in my chest like deep bass. I turned around and saw the trees shimmering slightly, like heat waves on asphalt. My arms tingled. My skin felt electric. I ran back to camp without taking another photo. I didn't say anything that night. What could I say? When I got into my tent, I lay still, heart racing. That's when the voices started. Not voices exactly, more like shapes in the static. Patterns that almost sounded like words, garbled mechanical phrases. "Can't stay," "behind you," "return." I pressed my hands over my ears. Didn't help. At some point, I fell asleep. When I woke up, the sun was up and my tent had been moved. Not far, maybe 5 or 6 feet, but it was no longer in line with Dan and Marla's tents, which were still side by side. Mine was skewed, facing the opposite direction. I confronted them. "Did one of you move my tent?" They both looked confused. "Why would we do that?" I checked the pegs. They'd been pulled up, then reinserted, neatly, like someone had relocated the whole thing carefully. I didn't sleep at all that final night. The static returned around midnight, as expected. This time it was accompanied by a metallic click from just outside the tent. Not a twig snap, a click, like someone flicking their fingernail on the zipper pull. Then silence, then static again. I turned on my flashlight, fresh batteries, and scanned around. Nothing. And yet faintly on the wall of the tent, I saw shadows shifting. Tall, thin, twitchy. Then I saw a spark, just a blip, on the inside of my tent, as if something had shorted out midair. By morning, the buzzing had faded. Everything felt normal. Dan and Marla were chipper, rested, laughing about oatmeal that wouldn't boil. I stayed quiet. We hiked out that afternoon. I never told them how I'd found my sleeping bag zipper melted shut at the top, like someone had tried to open it with a live wire. I've been camping since. Never had anything like that happen again, but sometimes when a thunderstorm rolls through and the pressure changes, I swear I hear that hum, low, lingering, waiting. And sometimes late at night, the static doesn't come from outside. It comes from the dead batteries in my drawer, still warm to the touch.